The rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of the Grand Heritage Hotel as Kenny Rogers stepped through the ornate lobby doors, shaking droplets from his worn leather jacket. The November storm had caught him completely off guard, transforming what should have been a simple drive from Nashville to Memphis into a treacherous journey through sheets of rain that made the highway nearly impassable. The hotel's marble floors gleamed under elaborate crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with gold-framed photographs of dignitaries and celebrities from decades past. Kenny paused in the doorway, taking in the grandeur of a place that seemed frozen in time. The Grand Heritage Hotel had clearly seen better days, but it maintained an old-world elegance that spoke of a time when travel was an event rather than a necessity. Persian rugs covered sections of the marble floor, their deep reds and blues faded but still beautiful. Fresh flower arrangements, white lilies and yellow roses, filled crystal vases positioned throughout the lobby, their fragrance mixing with the scent of old wood polish and leather furniture that had been carefully maintained for generations. He hadn't planned to stay here. The place was far too fancy for his simple tastes, and he typically preferred the comfort of smaller, family-owned establishments where he could come and go without drawing attention. But the storm had made continuing his journey impossible, and when he'd called ahead to Memphis, they'd told him the highways were closed indefinitely. This was the only hotel within 50 miles that had reported vacancy, and even then, he'd had to pull some strings to get a room on such short notice. As Kenny approached the mahogany reception desk, he noticed the careful attention to detail that spoke of an establishment that had once regularly catered to the wealthy and famous. The desk itself was a work of art, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of dark wood and polished to a mirror shine. Behind it, a wall of cubbyholes held old-fashioned brass keys, rather than the plastic cards most hotels use these days. Above the cubbyholes, a collection of framed photographs showed the hotel in its heyday: elegant parties in the ballroom, famous guests posing in the garden, award ceremonies that had apparently taken place in the main dining room. "Good evening, Mr. Rogers," the desk clerk said with practiced professionalism, though Kenny could see the young man's eyes widen slightly with recognition. He was perhaps 25, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested he'd been trained in the old school of hospitality service. "We have a junior suite available on the 3rd floor, overlooking the gardens. Will that be suitable for the evening?" Kenny nodded, appreciating the young man's discretion. In his experience, the best hotel staff understood that celebrities often valued privacy above luxury. "That sounds perfect. Thank you." The clerk, his name tag read Michael, processed the registration with efficient movements, occasionally glancing up with the kind of respectful curiosity that suggested he was a fan but wouldn't dream of imposing. "We're honored to have you staying with us, sir. If there's anything you need during your visit, please don't hesitate to call the front desk. We have room service available until midnight, and our concierge can arrange transportation or dinner reservations if the weather clears." Kenny accepted the old-fashioned brass key, room 315, rather than asking for a modern key card. He appreciated places that maintained traditions, even if they seemed outdated in an age of digital everything. There was something satisfying about the weight of real metal in his hand, a tangible connection to the countless guests who had stayed in this room before him. As he made his way toward the elevator, pulling his small-wheeled suitcase behind him, Kenny took note of the other guests scattered throughout the lobby. An elderly couple sat near the fireplace, sharing a pot of tea and speaking in quiet voices about their plans for the next day. A businessman in an expensive suit worked on his laptop near the windows, occasionally looking up to watch the rain stream down the glass. A middle-aged woman with an art history book balanced on her lap seemed to be cataloging the paintings that hung throughout the space. It was as Kenny waited for the elevator that he heard something that made him pause. A sound so faint he almost missed it over the ambient noise of the lobby. It was soft sobbing, coming from somewhere down the corridor that led away from the main reception area. Kenny stopped, tilting his head to listen more carefully. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard while their heart was breaking. The sound tugged at something deep in Kenny's chest, a recognition born from his own experiences with loss and hardship. He'd heard that particular kind of crying before, the silent weeping of someone who had learned to grieve quietly, who couldn't afford the luxury of public tears. It was the sound his mother had made during the worst financial struggles of his childhood, when she thought her children weren't listening. Following the sound, Kenny walked quietly down a side hallway lined with doors marked "Staff Only" and "Storage." The corridor was narrower than the main lobby areas, with simpler furnishings and fluorescent lighting that seemed harsh after the warm glow of the chandeliers. The sobbing was coming from around the corner, near what appeared to be a service area where housekeeping carts were stored between shifts. As he turned the corner, Kenny saw her. A woman in her 50s sat on a small wooden stool beside a housekeeping cart loaded with fresh linens, cleaning supplies, and the small amenities that made hotel guests feel welcomed. She wore the simple gray uniform of hotel staff, a tailored dress with the hotel's emblem embroidered on the breast pocket, sensible black shoes that had clearly seen years of long shifts on marble floors, and a name tag that read Elena. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun that had come slightly undone during what had obviously been a long day of work. Her shoulders shook with each quiet sob, and Kenny could see she was holding something in her lap. A crumpled piece of paper that looked like it might be official correspondence of some kind. Her posture spoke of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time. Someone who had learned to find private moments to release the pressure of accumulated stress and sorrow. What struck Kenny most was the way she held herself even in her distress. Despite her obvious emotional pain, there was a dignity in her bearing that reminded him of the countless hardworking people he'd known throughout his life. People who faced difficulty with grace, who maintained their self-respect even when circumstances tried to strip it away. Kenny hesitated for a moment, not wanting to intrude on such a private moment. He understood the importance of allowing people their grief, and he respected the fact that this woman had sought out a secluded place where she thought she could cry without being observed. But something about her posture, the way she held herself with such careful control even while breaking down, reminded him powerfully of his own mother during the hardest times of his childhood. He couldn't simply walk away. "Excuse me," he said softly, approaching with the careful movements of someone who understood that grief required gentle handling. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up with red-rimmed eyes, startled to see a guest in this back corridor that was clearly meant to be off-limits to hotel patrons. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand and attempted to compose herself, though her trembling betrayed her emotional state. Kenny could see her mentally shifting gears, trying to transform herself from a woman in crisis back into the professional, invisible service provider that her job required her to be. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her voice thick with tears and what Kenny recognized as a faint European accent. Polish, perhaps, or Czech. The accent became more pronounced under stress, suggesting it was something she normally worked to minimize. "I didn't think anyone would be back here. I was just taking a short break. I'll get back to work right away." She started to rise from the stool, automatically smoothing her uniform and checking that her name tag was straight. But Kenny held up a gentle hand to stop her. "Please, don't apologize. And don't feel like you need to rush off on my account. I'm Kenny, by the way." He kept his voice low and unthreatening, the same tone he might use to approach a frightened animal. The woman paused, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people quickly as a matter of professional survival. Kenny could see the moment of recognition dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by a flash of embarrassment that someone famous had caught her in such a vulnerable state. "I know who you are, Mr. Rogers. I'm Elena Kowalski. I clean the rooms here." She gestured vaguely toward the housekeeping cart, then seemed to remember the paper in her hands and quickly folded it, as if hiding evidence of her distress. "You shouldn't be back here, sir. This area is for staff only." "Elena," Kenny repeated, noting the musical quality of her name and the way it seemed to suit her despite her current circumstances. "That's a beautiful name. And please, don't worry about where I should or shouldn't be. Would you mind if I asked what's wrong? Sometimes it helps to talk to a stranger." Elena's carefully maintained composure began to crack again. Kenny could see her internal struggle. Part of her wanted to maintain the professional distance that her job required, while another part was desperate for someone, anyone, to acknowledge that she was more than just an invisible service provider. "It's nothing really, just work troubles. You don't need to worry about the help, Mr. Rogers." But Kenny could see this was more than simple workplace stress. The paper in her hands, the depth of her sorrow, the way she seemed to be carrying a weight far heavier than whatever problems a cleaning job might bring, all of it suggested something much more significant was happening in Elena's life. "Elena, I've learned something in my years on this earth," Kenny said, settling against the wall as if he had all the time in the world to listen. "The most important troubles are rarely the ones that seem obvious on the surface, and everybody deserves to have someone listen when their heart is heavy." Elena looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether she could trust this stranger with her burden. Kenny could see her calculating the risks. Would talking to a famous guest get her in trouble with management? Could she afford to be vulnerable with someone who existed in a completely different world from her own? Finally, she unfolded the paper and held it out with shaking hands. "This came today," she said quietly. "It's an eviction notice. I have 30 days to find somewhere else to live." Kenny took the notice and read it quickly. The language was formal and cold, full of legal terminology that transformed human displacement into bureaucratic procedure. The document stated that the apartment building where Elena lived was being demolished to make way for luxury condominiums. All tenants were required to vacate within 30 days, with no provisions for relocation assistance or consideration of the financial impact on long-term residents. "I've lived in that apartment for 12 years, Elena continued, her voice breaking as she spoke. "It's not much, just a one-bedroom place in an old building. But it's home. It's where I've built my life in America. And with what they pay here, I can't afford anything else in the city. The rents have gone up so much in the past few years. I'll have to move somewhere far away, maybe leave Tennessee altogether." Kenny felt anger rising in his chest, not at Elena, but at a system that could displace someone so casually, that could treat housing as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold without regard for the human cost. He'd seen this story repeated countless times. Working people pushed out of communities they'd helped build, forced to start over somewhere else because their presence was no longer economically convenient. "What about your family?" Kenny asked gently. "Is there anyone who could help?" Elena shook her head, and Kenny saw fresh tears threatening to spill over. "My husband died 3 years ago. Cancer. The medical bills took most of our savings, and I've been trying to catch up ever since. I thought I was making progress. I'd managed to pay down some of the debt, and I was starting to feel like maybe I could get ahead. But now this..." She gestured helplessly at the eviction notice. "My daughter lives in California with her own family. She's a teacher, married to a good man, but they have their own mortgage and 2 children to think about. She doesn't know how bad things have gotten for me. I don't want to be a burden to her. She has enough to worry about." As Elena spoke, Kenny found himself studying her more carefully, looking beyond the obvious markers of her current circumstances. Despite her distress, there was something in her posture, in the way she held her hands, that suggested a different kind of life before this one. Her fingers were long and elegant, moving with a subtle grace that spoke of muscle memory developed over years of practice. Even her speaking voice, underneath the accent and the emotion, had a musical quality that suggested someone who understood rhythm and tone in ways that went beyond casual conversation. "Elena, forgive me for asking, but before you worked here, what did you do for a living?" Elena's expression changed, a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or longing, crossing her features. For a moment, Kenny glimpsed the woman she had been before circumstances had forced her into this gray uniform, before financial necessity had reshaped her identity around survival rather than fulfillment. "I was a pianist," she said quietly, her voice taking on a different quality as she spoke the words. "I studied at the conservatory in Prague before I came to America. But that was a long time ago. That was a different life." Kenny felt his heart skip a beat. "You're a musician?" "Was," Elena corrected firmly, though Kenny could hear the pain in the correction. "I haven't played seriously in years. There's no piano in my apartment. I could never afford one, and I certainly can't afford to rent practice time anywhere. My hands..." She looked down at her fingers, now rough from years of cleaning work, calloused from handling industrial cleaning supplies and constantly washing linens. "They're not what they used to be." But Kenny could see that wasn't entirely true. Even as she spoke about her lost musical life, Elena's fingers moved slightly, as if playing an invisible keyboard. The muscle memory was still there, waiting beneath the surface like a spring that had been temporarily diverted, but never dried up. "What kind of music did you play?" Kenny asked gently, settling more comfortably against the wall to signal that he wasn't in any hurry to end this conversation. Elena's eyes grew distant, and for a moment, the service corridor seemed to fade away as she transported herself back to a different time and place. "Classical mostly. Chopin, Debussy, Rachmaninoff. I loved the Romantics, Schumann, Brahms, Liszt. But I also loved American jazz and blues. There was something about the freedom in that music, the way it could tell stories without words, the way it let you improvise and find new meanings in familiar melodies." Kenny nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Music is the universal language, isn't it? It speaks to something deeper than words can reach. Yes, exactly. For the first time since he'd found her crying, Elena smiled slightly and Kenny caught a glimpse of the passionate artist she had been. You understand because you're a musician too. Music is the way I make sense of the world. When I played, I could express things I never could have said in conversation. I could work through emotions that were too complex for words. I could connect with something larger than myself. Elena paused, then continued with growing intensity. In Prague, before I came here, I used to perform regularly. Not as a soloist. I was never quite good enough for that. But with chamber groups, as an accompanist for singers, sometimes in jazz clubs where they let me stretch out and improvise. I was making a living doing what I loved, and I thought that would always be my life. What changed? Kenny asked, though he suspected he already knew the general outline of the story. Life, Elena said simply. My husband and I came to America with such dreams. He was an engineer, and he thought there would be better opportunities here. I thought I could continue my musical career, maybe even expand it. But it turned out to be much harder than we expected. The music world here is very different, more commercial, more closed to outsiders, especially immigrants without connections. Elena's voice took on a bitter edge. I tried for a few years. I auditioned for everything, orchestras, chamber groups, accompanist positions, but there were always reasons why they chose someone else. Sometimes they said my style was too European, too formal. Sometimes they said it wasn't European enough, that I lacked authenticity. I started to suspect that the real problem was my accent, my last name, the fact that I didn't fit neatly into any category they understood. Kenny felt a familiar anger at the gatekeeping that plagued the music industry, the way talent could be overlooked because of prejudice or narrow thinking. When did you stop trying? He asked. When my husband got sick, Elena replied immediately. The medical bills started piling up, and we needed steady income with health insurance. I took this job thinking it would be temporary, just until he got better, just until we got back on our feet. But he didn't get better, and after he died, I was too broken to think about music. It felt irrelevant, selfish somehow. Elena looked down at her hands again. These hands used to create beauty. Now they clean up other people's messes. Sometimes I can barely remember what it felt like to play. To lose myself in a piece of music and come out the other side feeling like I'd touched something sacred. Kenny was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of Elena's story. Here was someone who had given up her calling not from lack of talent or dedication, but from the crushing necessities of survival in a system that didn't value her gifts. It was a story he'd heard too many times, in too many variations. Elena, he said finally, would you mind if I asked you something that might seem strange? She looked at him curiously. Of course. Would you play something for me? Elena's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with sadness. Mr. Rogers, I told you, I don't have access to a piano. And even if I did, it's been so long, I couldn't possibly… The hotel has a piano, Kenny interrupted gently. A beautiful grand piano in the main lounge. I saw it when I came in. Elena shook her head immediately, the suggestion clearly frightening her. Oh no, I couldn't. That's for guests, for special events. The staff isn't allowed to use the guest areas for personal purposes, especially not for something like that. What if you weren't staff for a few minutes? Kenny asked with a slight smile. What if you were my guest? Elena stared at him as if he'd suggested something impossible, something that violated the fundamental order of the universe. I couldn't ask you to do that. It wouldn't be appropriate. Management would… Elena, you're not asking. I'm offering. And as for appropriate, I think there are times when what's human matters more than what's appropriate. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Kenny could see her wrestling with desire and propriety, with the dream of touching piano keys again, and the fear of overstepping boundaries that had been drilled into her by years of service work. I haven't played for anyone in over 10 years, she whispered finally. Then maybe it's time, Kenny said softly. 20 minutes later, after Elena had cleaned up in the staff bathroom and changed out of her work uniform into a simple black dress she kept in her locker for formal hotel events, they made their way to the hotel's main lounge. Elena moved carefully through the lobby, clearly uncomfortable being in guest areas while off duty, but Kenny walked beside her with the confident air of someone who belonged anywhere he chose to be. The lounge was a study in understated elegance, with deep leather chairs arranged around small tables, Persian rugs that complemented those in the lobby, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto rain-soaked gardens illuminated by carefully placed spotlights. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and the lighting was warm and intimate, designed to encourage quiet conversation and relaxation. At the far end of the room sat a magnificent black Steinway grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the soft light from table lamps scattered throughout the space. The piano was clearly well maintained, its bench positioned at exactly the right height, a few pieces of sheet music arranged neatly on the music stand even though no performance was scheduled. The lounge was moderately occupied, perhaps a dozen guests scattered throughout the space, some reading newspapers or books, others having quiet conversations over drinks, a few working on laptops while occasionally glancing up to watch the rain stream down the windows. The atmosphere was peaceful and contemplative, exactly the kind of environment where live music would be welcomed rather than intrusive. Kenny approached the bar, where a middle-aged bartender with kind eyes and the polished manner of someone who'd spent decades in hospitality was preparing drinks with practiced efficiency. "Excuse me," Kenny said. "Would it be possible for my friend here to play the piano for a few minutes? She's a very talented musician, and I think your guests might enjoy hearing some beautiful music on such a stormy evening." The bartender, his name tag read Robert, looked from Kenny to Elena and back again. Kenny could see him calculating the situation, weighing hotel policy against customer service and the obvious status of the guest making the request. "Well, Mr. Rogers, we don't usually allow non-scheduled performances in the lounge, but I suppose if it's just for a few minutes, and if the other guests don't mind." He looked around the room with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to read a crowd. "Actually, some live music might be nice on an evening like this." Kenny looked around the room as well. "Would anyone object to some beautiful piano music?" The guests in the lounge looked up with interest rather than annoyance. An elderly gentleman sitting near the piano actually smiled and nodded encouragingly. A young couple sharing a bottle of wine near the windows turned in their chairs to get a better view. Even the business travelers looked up from their laptops with expressions of pleasant anticipation. "There you have it," Kenny said to Elena. "You have an audience who'd love to hear you play." Elena approached the piano as if it were a long-lost friend she wasn't sure would remember her. She lifted the keyboard cover with reverent hands, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them, feeling the familiar spacing and resistance that she hadn't experienced in years. The piano was perfectly tuned, its touch responsive and warm, clearly maintained by someone who understood that such an instrument was more than just furniture. "What would you like to hear?" she asked Kenny, her voice barely above a whisper. "Play whatever speaks to your heart," Kenny replied. "Music should come from inside, not from requests." Elena sat on the bench and adjusted her position, her hands hovering over the keys for a moment as she seemed to center herself. Kenny could see her taking deep breaths, preparing not just to play but to open herself to an experience she hadn't allowed herself in years. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to draw strength from some long-dormant part of herself, she began to play. The first notes were tentative, as if she were testing not just the piano but her own ability to remember how to translate emotion into music. She started with something simple, a Chopin nocturne that Kenny recognized but couldn't name. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with the kind of melancholy that spoke of autumn evenings and lost love, of beauty that exists precisely because it is temporary. But as Elena's confidence grew, so did her playing. Her touch became more assured, her interpretation more personal. What had started as a careful reproduction of a well-known piece gradually transformed into something uniquely hers, as if she were having a conversation with Chopin across the centuries, adding her own voice to his eternal melody. The music that filled the lounge was nothing short of extraordinary. Elena's years away from the piano seemed to melt away as her fingers found their old certainty. The technical skills were all still there. The precise timing, the dynamic control, the ability to make a single instrument sound like an entire orchestra. But more than that, her playing had gained something that only comes from living through real joy and real sorrow. Kenny watched not just Elena's hands but her entire being as she played. The woman who had been sobbing in the hallway 40 minutes earlier had been transformed. Her back was straight, her expression focused but peaceful, and there was a radiance about her that spoke of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. It was as if the music was flowing through her rather than from her, as if she had become a conduit for something larger than herself. The nocturne flowed seamlessly into something Kenny didn't recognize. A piece that seemed to blend classical technique with jazz harmonies, creating a sound that was both sophisticated and deeply emotional. Elena's hands moved with increasing confidence, finding patterns and progressions that seemed to arise spontaneously from the conversation between her heart and the keys. The other guests in the lounge had stopped their conversations entirely to listen. The bartender had paused in his work, and Kenny noticed that several hotel staff members had gathered in the doorway to hear the unexpected concert. The music seemed to cast a spell over the entire space, creating a bubble of beauty in the midst of an ordinary evening. Elena transitioned from piece to piece with the fluidity of someone who understood that music was meant to be a continuous conversation rather than a series of separate performances. She played Debussy with impressionistic delicacy, Chopin with romantic passion, and then surprised everyone by launching into a jazz interpretation of Autumn Leaves that showcased a completely different side of her musical personality. Kenny found himself thinking about the unfairness of a world that could allow such talent to go unheard, where economic necessity could force someone to abandon their calling. Elena wasn't just a good pianist, she was exceptional, the kind of musician who could move people to tears or lift their spirits with equal ease. More than that, she was an artist with something important to say, someone who had lived through enough joy and sorrow to give real depth to her interpretations. As Elena finished her improvised jazz piece and moved into what Kenny recognized as a Rachmaninoff prelude, he noticed that more people had entered the lounge. Word was apparently spreading through the hotel that something special was happening, and guests were quietly making their way to the main floor to listen. The Rachmaninoff was technically demanding, requiring both physical strength and emotional vulnerability, and Elena played it with a combination of power and sensitivity that left Kenny breathless. This wasn't just competent playing. This was artistry of the highest order, the kind of performance that reminded listeners why music mattered, why it was essential to the human experience. When Elena finally brought the prelude to its thunderous conclusion, the lounge erupted in spontaneous applause. The guests were clearly moved by what they'd heard, and several approached the piano to express their appreciation personally. "That was absolutely magnificent," said the elderly gentleman who had nodded encouragingly earlier. "I haven't heard playing like that since my wife and I used to attend concerts at Carnegie Hall. You have a rare gift, young lady." "Beautiful," murmured the young couple, the woman wiping tears from her eyes. "Thank you for sharing that with us." Even the business travelers had closed their laptops, drawn into the spell of Elena's music. One of them, a woman in her 40s who looked like she spent her life in conference rooms, approached with obvious emotion. "I studied piano as a child," she said quietly, "but I gave it up when I went to college. Hearing you play reminded me why I loved it so much. Thank you for that gift." Elena blushed at the praise, but Kenny could see how much it meant to her. This was recognition for who she truly was, not just acknowledgement of her service as hotel staff. For these few minutes, she had been seen and appreciated as an artist, as someone with something valuable to offer the world. "Elena," Kenny said as the small crowd gradually dispersed, "that was incredible. You have a gift that deserves to be shared with the world." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of remembering who she was beneath the uniform and the circumstances that had temporarily obscured her true identity. "Thank you for this, Mr. Rogers," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be myself again." "What do you mean?" "When you spend your days cleaning other people's rooms, picking up their messes, being invisible except when they need something, you start to forget that you're more than just your job. You start to define yourself by your circumstances rather than your gifts. Tonight, for these few minutes, I remembered that I'm a musician. That's who I really am, underneath everything else." Kenny nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He'd seen it happen to countless people. The gradual erosion of identity that comes from being valued only for what you can do rather than who you are. "Elena, what if I told you that didn't have to be just a memory? What if there was a way for you to be a musician again? Not just for a few stolen minutes, but as your daily reality?" Elena looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism, the expression of someone who had learned not to trust in fairy tale solutions. "Mr. Rogers, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but let's be realistic. I'm 53 years old, I haven't performed professionally in over a decade, and I need to find a place to live in 30 days. Dreams are beautiful, but they don't pay rent." What if they could? Kenny asked quietly. Over the next hour, as they sat in a quiet corner of the lounge sharing coffee and talking while the storm continued to rage outside, Kenny learned more about Elena's story. She had come to America 25 years earlier with her husband, both of them filled with dreams of opportunity and success. She had tried to establish herself as a pianist, but the music world was competitive and often unwelcoming to immigrants without connections or the right kind of background. When her husband became ill, she'd taken the hotel job to ensure they had steady income and health insurance, always intending it to be temporary. But temporary had stretched into years, and somewhere along the way, she'd stopped believing in her own talent, stopped seeing herself as anything more than someone who cleaned up after other people. The worst part, Elena confided, isn't even the financial struggle, though that's certainly real. It's the way you start to disappear, even to yourself. When no one sees you as anything more than a service provider, when your entire existence is organized around other people's comfort and convenience, you start to forget that you have inner life, that you have dreams and talents and things to offer beyond your ability to make beds and scrub bathrooms. Kenny felt a deep sadness as Elena spoke, recognizing the psychological damage that could come from work that reduced people to their most basic functions. He'd been fortunate enough to make a living from his art, but he knew that was a rare privilege, and he understood how easily circumstances could force someone to set aside their calling in favor of survival. "Elena," Kenny said as their conversation wound down, "I want to make you an offer, but I need you to hear me out completely before you respond." Elena nodded, though Kenny could see the wariness in her eyes. "I have a recording studio in Nashville and I work with musicians all the time, not just country artists, but jazz musicians, classical players, people who love music the way you do. I also know people in the business, people who are always looking for talented musicians for various projects." Elena started to shake her head, but Kenny held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'd like to offer you a job, not as a cleaning lady, but as a musician. I need someone to help with arrangements, to play piano on recordings, to work with other artists who come through the studio. The pay would be good, enough for you to rent a nice apartment in Nashville and have access to pianos whenever you want to practice." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Rogers, you barely know me. You heard me play for 20 minutes. You can't possibly—" "Elena, I've been in the music business for 40 years. I know talent when I hear it, and what I heard tonight was extraordinary. You're not just technically proficient, you have something that can't be taught. You have soul, you have lived experience that deepens your interpretation, and you have a musical intelligence that allows you to communicate across different styles and genres." Kenny leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity of someone who believed deeply in what he was saying. "More than that, you deserve a chance to live as who you really are. You deserve to wake up every morning knowing that your work matters, that you're using your gifts, that you're contributing something beautiful to the world." Elena was quiet for a long moment, tears streaming down her face as she processed what Kenny was offering. "Why would you do this for me? We're strangers." Kenny thought about her question, searching for the right words to explain something he wasn't entirely sure he understood himself. "Elena, I've been blessed in my career in ways that many musicians never are. I've had success, recognition, financial security, things that are largely matters of luck and timing as much as talent. But with that blessing comes a responsibility. When you have the power to change someone's life for the better, especially someone with real talent who just needs an opportunity, I believe you have an obligation to act." He paused, thinking about all the times someone had taken a chance on him when he was young and unknown, all the doors that had opened because someone had seen potential in him and decided to help. "Besides, this isn't charity. I genuinely need good musicians, and you are undeniably a gifted musician. This would be good for both of us." Elena covered her face with her hands and began to cry again. But these were tears of relief and gratitude rather than despair. When she looked up, her expression was transformed. The hopelessness that had marked her features earlier was gone, replaced by something Kenny hadn't seen before, a sense of possibility, of future, of dreams that might actually come true. "Mr. Rogers, Kenny, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me, Elena. Just promise me you'll never stop playing. The world needs your music." 3 months later, Kenny received a package at his Nashville office. Inside was a professionally produced CD with a simple, elegant cover design. Elena's photograph, not in her hotel uniform, but in a black evening dress seated at a concert grand piano. Above the title, "Second Movement." The liner notes explained that this was Elena Kowalski's debut album, a collection of original compositions that blended her classical training with American jazz and blues influences. Kenny put the CD into his stereo and listened as Elena's piano filled his office with the most beautiful music he'd heard in years. She had recorded a collection of pieces that told the story of her journey, from the old country to the new world, from dreams to disappointment, to the unexpected gift of second chances. The compositions were sophisticated and emotionally complex, drawing on her years of study in Prague, while incorporating the jazz and blues traditions she'd fallen in love with in America. The opening track, Prague Morning, captured the bittersweet beauty of leaving home with a melody that was both nostalgic and hopeful. The second piece, Invisible Hands, told the story of her years in service work with harmonies that spoke of dignity maintained in the face of dismissal, of inner life persisting despite external circumstances designed to reduce her to a function rather than recognize her as a person. But it was the final track that moved Kenny most deeply. Titled The Melody in Room 237, the room number where Kenny had stayed the night they met, it was a hauntingly beautiful composition that told the story of their encounter without words. The piece began with sparse, lonely notes that captured the despair of that rainy evening, then gradually built to include themes of recognition, connection, and transformation. The music captured both the sorrow of nearly losing oneself and the joy of being seen and valued for who you truly are. Kenny played the track 3 times before picking up his phone to call his contact at Blue Note Records. Elena's talent deserved a wider audience than his personal recommendations could provide, and he knew exactly the person who could help make that happen. Sarah, it's Kenny Rogers. I need you to listen to something, and I need you to listen with an open mind. I'm about to send you a CD from an artist I think you need to sign immediately. Sarah Chen, one of the most respected A&R representatives in the jazz world, laughed. Kenny, you know I trust your ear, but Blue Note doesn't usually take recommendations for classical crossover artists. Sarah, this isn't about genre categories. This is about artistry. Elena Kowalski is the real thing, a musician with something important to say and the technical skills to say it beautifully. Give her a chance. Within a week, Sarah had called back with an offer for Elena to record a full album for Blue Note. The label was impressed not just with her technical skills, but with her unique voice as a composer. Her ability to bridge different musical traditions in ways that felt organic rather than forced. 6 months after their first meeting, Elena Kowalski released her debut album, Second Movement, which became a surprise hit in both the jazz and classical worlds. Critics praised her unique style and emotional depth, calling her a mature artist with something important to say, and a musician who proves that the most beautiful art comes from those who have lived through both joy and sorrow. But for Kenny, the real reward came when he attended Elena's first major public concert in Nashville. The Schermerhorn Symphony Center was sold out, filled with people who had heard about this remarkable pianist who had emerged seemingly from nowhere with a fully formed artistic voice. As Kenny watched Elena command the stage with confidence and grace, surrounded by accomplished musicians who clearly respected her talent, he remembered the broken woman he'd found crying in a hotel hallway. Elena performed pieces from her album along with classical repertoire and jazz standards, moving seamlessly between different styles and showing the audience the full range of her musical personality. When she played The Melody in Room 237, she prefaced it with the story of how she'd met Kenny. How a stranger's kindness had reminded her that she was more than her circumstances. Sometimes, she told the audience, we forget who we are underneath what life has done to us. Sometimes it takes another person to remind us that our gifts matter, that our dreams are worth pursuing regardless of our age or our circumstances. This piece is about that reminder, about the moment when someone sees you not as you appear but as you truly are. After the concert, Elena found Kenny in the crowd and hugged him tightly, just as she had after that first performance in the hotel lounge. You saved my life, she whispered, just as she had months earlier. No, Kenny replied. You saved your own life. I just reminded you that it was worth saving. Elena pulled back and looked at him with tears in her eyes. You know what the most amazing part is? When I was at my lowest point, ready to give up on everything I'd ever dreamed of, music brought me back. Not just playing music, but the fact that another musician recognized what I had to offer. It's like the universe conspired to put us in the same place at the same time. Kenny nodded, thinking about the storm that had forced him to stop at that particular hotel, the broken elevator that had sent him down the side corridor where he'd heard Elena crying, all the small coincidences that had aligned to create this moment. Elena, I've learned something in all my years in music. The most beautiful songs often come from the darkest places. Your pain didn't destroy your gift. It deepened it. That's what people hear when you play now. They hear someone who has lived through difficulty and found beauty on the other side. As Kenny drove home that night through the familiar streets of Nashville, he thought about the power of human connection, about how a simple act of recognition could ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. Elena's success wasn't just her triumph. It was a reminder that we all have the ability to change someone's life if we're willing to see past the surface to the person underneath. The radio played softly as he drove, and Kenny found himself humming along with a jazz piece that sounded remarkably like Elena's style. He smiled, realizing that her influence was already spreading through the music community, inspiring other musicians to explore the beautiful space between classical precision and jazz freedom. In the months that followed, Elena became a regular collaborator on Kenny's projects, bringing her unique voice to his recordings and introducing him to new ways of thinking about music. Their professional relationship deepened into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect. Elena would often tell people that working with Kenny had taught her that success in music wasn't just about individual achievement. It was about lifting others up, about using your platform to create opportunities for fellow artists. But perhaps more importantly, Elena's story began to inspire others throughout the word spread about the hotel cleaning lady who had become a respected jazz artist, and other musicians began looking more carefully at the people around them, wondering what hidden talents might be waiting for recognition. Elena used her success to establish a scholarship fund for immigrant musicians, understanding firsthand how difficult it could be to establish oneself in a new country without connect. She frequently performed benefit concerts, always ending with "The Melody in Room 237." and would tell the story of the rainy night when a stranger's kindness had changed her life. "I learned that evening that we are all more than our circumstances," she would tell audiences. "Sometimes we need another person to remind us of that truth, but sometimes we have the opportunity to be." The scholarship fund grew over the years, helping dozens of talented musicians who might otherwise have been forced to abandon their dreams in favor of economic survival. Elena made it a point to stay connected with each recipient, understanding that financial support was important, but that mentorship and encouragement. Years later, when interviewers asked Kenny about the most meaningful moment of his career, he wouldn't talk about his hit songs or awards or the accolades that had marked his decades in the music business. Instead, he would tell them about finding Elena crying in that hotel hallway, about the transformative power of recognizing someone's hidden worth, about the way music could serve as a bridge between two people. "Elena taught me that being successful isn't just about what you achieve for yourself," Kenny would say in interviews. "It's about what you help others achieve. The greatest gift I've ever received wasn't applause or recognition. It was the privilege of watching someone rediscover their own magic." Elena, now a respected artist with several albums and a growing international following, would always credit Kenny with saving her life. Elena had saved herself. She had maintained her dignity and her talent through years of difficult circumstances, had never completely given up on the possibility that things could be different. She just needed someone to remind her that she was worth believing in. The Grand Heritage Hotel still displays a small brass plaque near the piano in the main lounge. In memory of the evening when music reminded us that everyone has a story worth. Regular guests often ask about its meaning, and the staff tells them about the night a country music legend and a hotel cleaning lady created a moment of magic that changed both their lives forever. The hotel management, recognizing the significance of what had happened in their establishment, established an annual Elena Kowalski Music Scholarship for hotel employees. The scholarship provides funding for music lessons, instrument rental, and performance opportunities, ensuring that other hidden artists might have the chance to develop their gifts without having to choose between survival and their calling. Elena returns to perform at the hotel every year on the anniversary of her first meeting with Kenny, always playing in the same lounge where she. The performance has become a beloved tradition, drawing guests from around the world who want to witness the place where an act of simple human kindness transformed two lives and created ripples that continue to. In the end, Elena's story became a testament to several important truths. That talent exists everywhere, often hidden beneath circumstances that don't allow it to flourish. That a single moment of recognition can change the trajectory of someone's entire life. And that our success is measured not just by what we achieve for ourselves, but. The melody that began in room 237 on a rainy November night had grown into a symphony of hope that continued to inspire people around the world. It proved that sometimes the most beautiful music comes not from concert halls or recording studios, but from the courage to see the extraordinary in what others might dismiss as ordinary, from the willingness to believe that everyone deserves a chance to live as who they truly are, rather than what circumstances have. Kenny Rogers had started that evening as a traveler seeking shelter from a storm. He ended it as a witness to the power of music to transform lives, as a participant in a story that would remind him for the rest of his life that the most important performances often happen in the most unexpected places, for audiences of one, when someone decides that another person's dreams. If this story moved your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about the unexpected ways people can change each other's lives. And leave a comment below about a time when someone saw potential in you that you couldn't see in yourself. Sometimes all we need is one person to believe in us. And sometimes we have the opportunity to. The most beautiful melodies often begin with a single note of kindness, played at exactly the right moment.